"I can't spend the rest of my life taking care of a sick woman," my husband said 3 days after my diagnosis, standing in our kitchen, with one hand wrapped around the handle of a leather suitcase I bought him for our 25th anniversary. I remember staring at the navy blue tie hanging loosely around his neck and thinking how strange it was that after 41 years of marriage, the thing that hurt me most wasn't his words. It was the fact that he still remembered to pack his golf shoes before leaving me behind. 6 months later, Richard saw my face on national television, and for the first time in years, he looked like the weaker one. "I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 67 years old, and until last winter, I thought loyalty was something that lasted a lifetime." The diagnosis came on a Thursday morning in January. Outside the hospital windows, snow covered the parking lot in soft white layers, and people hurried through the cold carrying paper coffee cups and folded umbrellas. The doctor sat across from me with careful eyes and a voice trained to sound calm even when delivering life-changing news. I remember the ticking wall clock behind him. The faint smell of disinfectant. The way my wedding ring suddenly felt heavier on my hand. He explained everything slowly. Treatment options. Survival rates. Follow-up appointments. I nodded like a polite student listening to instructions she didn't fully understand. By the time I drove home, the winter sun had already started disappearing behind the trees lining our neighborhood. Richard was sitting in his recliner watching cable news when I walked into the living room. "You're home late," he said without looking away from the television. I stood there holding the folder from the hospital against my chest. For a moment, I still believed marriage meant safety. I still believed my husband would stand up, walk toward me, and say we'd face it together. Instead, he muted the television and frowned the way he did whenever the electric bill came higher than expected. "Well?" he asked. My voice sounded small in the quiet room. "They found something." He stared at me for several seconds without speaking. Then he leaned back in the chair and rubbed his jaw slowly. "How bad?" I explained as calmly as I could. I even tried smiling once or twice, as if making the diagnosis sound less frightening would somehow protect him from it. Richard listened in complete silence. No questions. No comfort. No reaching for my hand. When I finished speaking, he stood up and walked into the kitchen. I followed him, confused by the strange distance suddenly settling between us. He opened the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of iced tea, and stared out the window above the sink while I stood behind him waiting for him to say something that sounded like love. Instead, he sighed heavily and said, "This isn't how I pictured retirement." I felt something cold move through my chest. "Richard," he turned around then, older than I'd ever seen him. Not sad. Not heartbroken. Just irritated. Like life had handed him an inconvenience he didn't deserve. "My father spent 8 years taking care of my mother before she died," he said quietly. "Hospitals. Wheelchairs. Nurses. Medications. That wasn't a life, Evelyn." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Are you saying you want to leave?" He didn't answer immediately, which somehow hurt even more. He just looked down at the kitchen counter before finally saying, "I don't think I can do this." 3 days later, he packed 2 suitcases and left before sunrise. I heard the wheels rolling across the hardwood floor while I sat awake in bed pretending not to cry. The house felt enormous after the front door closed behind him. I walked downstairs wearing my old grey bathrobe and found his coffee mug sitting beside the sink. Half full. Still warm. Outside, snow drifted softly across the front lawn while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual. I stood there for a long time staring at the empty driveway, one hand pressed against my stomach, trying to understand how someone could spend 4 decades promising forever and still disappear the moment forever became difficult. By the end of that week, Richard had stopped answering most of my calls. His texts became shorter, colder, practical. Make sure the insurance paperwork gets submitted. The accountant needs your signature. I'll pick up the rest of my things next month. Not once did he ask if I was afraid. Not once did he ask if I'd eaten dinner or managed to sleep. At night, I sat alone in the living room with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen and wondering how long it takes for a marriage to disappear completely. I didn't know then that losing Richard would become the thing that saved my life. And I certainly didn't know that 6 months later, the man who walked away from me would nearly drop a glass of wine when my face appeared on television. The first Sunday after Richard left, I still cooked breakfast for 2 out of habit. I cracked 4 eggs into the skillet before realizing there was nobody sitting across from me anymore. The kitchen smelled like butter and coffee, but the house itself felt hollow, like something important had been removed from its foundation. I stood at the stove in my slippers, staring at the empty chair near the window, while snow melted slowly along the edges of the driveway outside. For 41 years, Richard had complained about my scrambled eggs being too soft. That morning I would have given anything to hear him complain one more time. Instead, the only sound came from the old refrigerator humming in the corner. I stopped turning on the television after a few days, because the silence somehow hurt less than cheerful voices pretending life was simple. The hardest part was not the diagnosis. It was discovering how quickly people disappear when illness enters the room. Richard's sister called once during the 2nd week. Her voice sounded uncomfortable, careful. She said she was sorry things were difficult right now. Then she mentioned Richard was just overwhelmed and needed space to process everything. Space. I looked around the living room at the blankets folded neatly over the couch, and the framed family photos lining the fireplace mantel. Richard had not needed space when I stayed up all night beside his hospital bed after his gallbladder surgery 10 years earlier. He had not needed space when I worked extra shifts at the bookstore to help pay off his business debts in the 1990s. But somehow my sickness had turned me into something inconvenient. Something heavy. I learned very quickly how expensive being sick in America could become. Even with insurance, the bills arrived in thick white envelopes that piled higher every week on the dining room table. Blood tests, scans, prescriptions, specialist visits. I opened each envelope slowly, almost afraid to breathe while reading the numbers printed in black ink at the bottom of the page. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat at the kitchen counter with a calculator beside my tea mug, trying to decide whether I could postpone one of the follow-up appointments until spring. Outside, neighborhood children rode bicycles down the street wearing puffy winter jackets, while their mothers called after them from front porches. Life continued everywhere except inside my house. I started sleeping on only one side of the bed, because looking at Richard's empty pillow made my chest ache in ways I could not explain. His closet still smelled faintly like cedarwood cologne and dry sheets. Sometimes I would open the door and just stand there staring at his jackets hanging perfectly still in the dim light. I kept telling myself to pack them away. I never did. One evening, I found myself sitting in the dark dining room long after sunset, with my untouched bowl of soup growing cold beside me. The grandfather clock ticked steadily near the hallway while snow tapped softly against the windows. I realized then that nobody had asked me how I was feeling in almost 3 weeks. Not really. The doctors asked about symptoms. Insurance representatives asked about policy numbers. Pharmacists asked about prescriptions. But nobody asked whether I was scared to wake up alone every morning, wondering if my body was betraying me a little more each day. Richard sent practical messages every few days. Nothing emotional. Nothing human. The accountant emailed you. The tax documents are in the garage cabinet. Do not forget the mortgage payment is due Friday. Each message sounded like it came from a bank manager, instead of the man who once slow danced with me barefoot in our kitchen after midnight. I answered politely every time, because anger required energy I no longer had. One afternoon in February, I slipped while carrying groceries from the car during freezing rain. The paper bag split open across the driveway, and cans rolled toward the curb, while cold rain soaked through my coat collar. I stood there trembling from exhaustion more than pain, staring at soup cans scattered across the concrete like tiny pieces of a life falling apart quietly where nobody could see. Then my neighbor, Claire Mitchell from across the street, hurried over holding an umbrella above both of us. She knelt beside me without saying anything dramatic, and helped gather the groceries one by one. "You should not be carrying all this by yourself," she said gently. I almost laughed at the word yourself. It sounded strange hearing it out loud because that was exactly what my life had become. Alone at doctor appointments. Alone at dinner. Alone at night listening to pipes creak inside an aging house while winter winds rattled the windows. Claire walked me to the front door carrying half the grocery bags in her arms. Before leaving, she glanced toward the quiet living room behind me and asked softly, "Do you have anyone staying with you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out at first. Because saying my husband left after my diagnosis still sounded too humiliating to become real. After Claire left that afternoon, I stood alone in the foyer holding the grocery bag against my chest while melting rainwater dripped from the hem of my coat onto the hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly like tomato soup and lemon furniture polish, the same way it had for years, but suddenly it no longer felt like the home I had spent most of my adult life protecting. It felt like a museum filled with evidence of a woman who had slowly disappeared without realizing it. That night, I wandered from room to room unable to sleep. I paused beside the family photos lining the hallway wall and studied them more carefully than I had in years. There was Richard smiling beside our station wagon during a summer trip to Cape Cod. Richard holding our daughter Caroline on his shoulders at Disney World when she was 6. Richard standing beside me at our 40th anniversary dinner wearing the navy suit I bought him after his retirement party. In every photograph, he looked dependable. Solid. The kind of man neighbors described as respectable. I used to believe those pictures told the truth about our marriage. But illness has a strange way of removing the soft lighting from old memories. Once Richard left, I started seeing things differently. Little moments I had ignored for decades began replaying in my mind while I lay awake at night listening to the heater click on and off. I remembered how quickly he changed the subject anytime I talked about my writing classes years ago. "That little hobby is not going to pay the bills," he once laughed during dinner with friends. Everyone chuckled politely while I smiled into my wine glass pretending the comment did not sting. I remembered the promotion I turned down at the bookstore because Richard did not want me traveling twice a month for regional meetings. "We barely see each other as it is," he told me back then. At the time, I thought sacrifice was simply part of being a good wife. Looking back now, I realized something painful. My entire life had slowly narrowed itself around his comfort. Richard always liked introducing himself as the provider in our marriage, but he never mentioned how many nights I stayed awake balancing checkbooks while he chased business ideas that rarely worked. He never mentioned the years I packed his lunches at 5 in the morning before working my own shifts. He never mentioned that when his company nearly collapsed in 2008, I quietly sold my mother's jewelry to help cover our mortgage payments. The strange thing was that I never resented any of it while we were building a life together. Love makes imbalance feel noble. At least that is what I told myself for 40 years. One afternoon in early March, I finally opened the cabinet in Richard's office where he kept old financial records and tax folders. Dust floated through the sunlight coming from the small window above the desk while I sorted through stacks of paperwork. I was searching for insurance documents when I found an envelope tucked beneath an old legal pad. Inside was a brochure for luxury condominiums in Scottsdale, Arizona. A handwritten note was clipped to the front. Unit 14B still available through April. My stomach tightened instantly. Richard had circled floor plans in blue ink months before my diagnosis. Months before he walked out carrying those suitcases through our kitchen. I sat there frozen in his office chair staring at the paper, while something cold settled over me. He had already been planning his next life, while I was still cooking dinner beside him every evening. Suddenly other details came rushing back. The long phone calls he took outside on the patio last fall. The sudden interest in golf vacations. The strange distance in his eyes whenever I talked about growing older together. I pressed both hands against my face and laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not because anything was funny. Because the truth finally sounded ridiculous in a way heartbreak never had before. I had spent weeks mourning the loss of a man who emotionally left our marriage long before the doctors found anything wrong with me. That realization hurt differently. Cleaner somehow. Less like grief and more like awakening. Later that evening, Caroline called from Chicago after finishing her nursing shift at the hospital. I had hidden most of the truth from her until then, because I did not want her worrying from 1,200 miles away. But something inside me finally cracked open during that conversation. I told her Richard left. I told her he packed suitcases 3 days after my diagnosis. Silence filled the phone line for several seconds before she whispered, "Mom, how long have you been carrying him?" I sat quietly in the dark living room holding the cordless phone against my ear while the grandfather clock ticked behind me. Outside, the snow had finally begun melting along the sidewalks, leaving patches of wet grass visible beneath winter's fading grip. For the first time in months, I realized spring was coming whether I was ready for it or not. By the middle of March, the snow had disappeared from our neighborhood completely, replaced by cold rain and muddy lawns scattered with early daffodils trying to push through the thawing ground. Every morning I forced myself into a routine, because routines felt safer than fear. I made coffee. Fed the birds outside the kitchen window. Checked the mailbox. Took my medication with dry toast because my stomach rarely tolerated much else anymore. Then I sat in the same recliner near the living room lamp where Richard used to watch television and stared at the quiet street outside. Some days I barely spoke out loud at all. The silence changed a person after a while. It sharpened certain thoughts until they became impossible to ignore. One Thursday afternoon, I drove myself to a follow-up appointment downtown during heavy rain. Traffic crawled slowly along the interstate, while windshield wipers slapped back and forth in steady rhythm. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel from exhaustion. Treatment had started draining energy from my body in ways I had not expected. Even climbing stairs left me breathless some mornings. At the clinic, the waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer. Elderly couples sat together flipping through magazines, while younger patients stared at their phones with hollow expressions. Across from me, a man gently tucked a blanket around his wife's shoulders while she rested against him with closed eyes. I looked away almost immediately because the sight hurt more than I wanted to admit. During the appointment, my doctor adjusted medications and asked careful questions about side effects. I answered automatically while watching rainwater slide down the windows behind him. Before leaving, he paused beside the door and said, "You should consider joining one of the local support groups. Isolation can make recovery harder." I almost laughed at the word recovery. At that point I was not sure what exactly I was recovering from anymore. The illness, the marriage, or the humiliating realization that I had built my entire identity around being needed by someone who walked away the second life became inconvenient. On the drive home, rain poured so heavily I could barely see the road ahead. About 2 miles from the house, dizziness suddenly washed over me. Without warning. My vision blurred around the edges while panic tightened in my chest. I pulled into the parking lot of a small grocery store, and sat there gripping the steering wheel while cold rain hammered against the windshield. For several minutes, I could not move. I felt old for the first time in my life. Not physically old. Spiritually old. Like the world had quietly decided I was no longer worth protecting. Eventually I stepped out of the car, hoping fresh air might help steady me. Instead, my knees weakened halfway across the parking lot. The next thing I remember clearly was the rough feeling of wet pavement beneath my palms and a stranger's voice saying, "Stay still for a second." A woman around my age knelt beside me holding a large umbrella over both of us while rainwater soaked the edges of her jeans. Her silver hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she smelled faintly like lavender soap. "I am fine," I whispered automatically, even though I clearly was not. She gave me a look only women our age understand. The kind that says we have spent decades pretending we are stronger than we feel. "Of course you are," she said gently. "But you still need help standing up." Her name was Diane Mercer. She owned the small bookstore beside the grocery store parking lot, and insisted on bringing me inside until the dizziness passed. The store smelled like old paper and cinnamon candles. Soft jazz played quietly through ceiling speakers, while rain tapped against the front windows. Diane handed me a mug of chamomile tea, and sat across from me at a small reading table near the back shelves. For a while, neither of us spoke much. There was something comforting about sitting beside another woman, who did not rush to fill silence with empty encouragement. Eventually she glanced at me carefully and asked, "Who is taking care of you?" The question settled heavily between us. I stared down at the steam rising from my teacup before answering quietly, "Nobody, actually." Diane nodded slowly like she already suspected the truth. Then she said something I would think about for weeks afterward. "Women like us spend so many years keeping everyone else alive that we forget we are allowed to belong to ourselves too." Outside, rain continued falling in silver sheets across the parking lot while customers drifted quietly through the bookstore aisles. For the first time since Richard left, I felt something unfamiliar stir inside me. Not happiness. Not hope exactly. Just the faintest sense that maybe my life had not ended when my marriage did. After that afternoon in Diane's bookstore, I found myself driving there again 3 days later without fully planning to. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the town washed clean beneath pale April sunlight. Small puddles shimmered along the sidewalks, while flowering trees scattered pink petals across parked cars and storefront windows. For the first time in months, I noticed spring arriving around me instead of simply enduring it. Diane looked up from behind the counter when I walked inside carrying my canvas tote bag, and gave me a quiet smile like she had been expecting me. "I just put on a fresh pot of coffee," she said. No pity. No dramatic concern. Just warmth. It felt strange how comforting ordinary kindness could become after weeks of emotional abandonment. I started spending a few afternoons each week at the bookstore after medical appointments. Sometimes I helped Diane organize shelves or restock paperbacks, while soft music drifted through the shop. Other times we simply sat together near the reading corner drinking tea and talking about ordinary things. Gardening. Old movies. Recipes neither of us cooked anymore because there was nobody left at home asking for favorites. Diane had been divorced nearly 15 years and carried herself with the calm steadiness of someone who already survived disappointment long ago. One afternoon, while sorting donated books in the storage room, she pulled out a faded hardcover memoir and handed it to me. "You used to teach creative writing, right?" she asked casually. I blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" "You tell stories like a woman who spent her life swallowing them first," she replied. The comment lingered in my mind all evening after I returned home. That night, instead of sitting silently in front of the television, I opened the old cedar chest in the hallway closet, where I stored journals and unfinished writing projects from years earlier. Dust rose into the air as I lifted notebooks filled with recipes, holiday lists, and fragments of essays I barely remembered writing. Beneath everything else, I found a yellow folder labeled Women's Community Workshop. My fingers tightened around it instantly. 20 years earlier, before Richard's business struggles consumed our lives, I used to volunteer at the local community center teaching writing workshops for widows and single mothers. I had forgotten how alive those evenings once made me feel. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table beside the window with a cup of coffee growing cold near my elbow and began writing for the first time in years. At first the words came slowly. Careful. Hesitant. Like strangers approaching each other after a long silence. I wrote about hospital waiting rooms. About loneliness. About becoming invisible inside your own marriage while everyone else still called it love. Hours passed without me noticing. Outside, lawnmowers hummed across the neighborhood while sunlight moved slowly across the hardwood floor. When I finally looked up, it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. For the first time since my diagnosis, I realized I had gone several hours without thinking about Richard at all. A week later, Diane convinced me to attend a small women's support gathering held every Wednesday evening above the bookstore. I almost cancelled twice before going. The old version of me hated burdening strangers with personal pain. But when I climbed the narrow staircase and entered the room filled with folding chairs and paper coffee cups, nobody looked polished or perfect. There were women recovering from illness. Women grieving husbands. Women rebuilding lives after divorce at ages society quietly tells us rebuilding should already be over. One woman cried softly while talking about losing her home after medical debt buried her savings. Another admitted she had not celebrated her birthday in 3 years because she was embarrassed to spend it alone. I listened quietly for most of the evening until Diane gently touched my arm and asked, "Would you like to share anything?" Every eye in the room turned toward me. My throat tightened immediately. For a second, I almost shook my head and stayed silent like I always had. But something inside me felt too tired to keep pretending anymore. So I told them the truth. I told them my husband left 3 days after my diagnosis because he did not want to spend retirement caring for a sick wife. I expected embarrassment after speaking the words aloud. Instead, the room remained completely still. One woman reached for a tissue. Another quietly whispered, "I am so sorry." Then an older woman near the window looked directly at me and said something that settled deep into my chest. "Honey, that man did not leave because you became weak. He left because your illness exposed how weak he already was." Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, while evening rain began tapping against the windows again. And for the first time in months, I did not feel ashamed anymore. I just felt awake. By early May, the bookstore had quietly become part of my routine in the same way grocery lists and evening tea once were. Every Wednesday night, the women upstairs gathered beneath soft fluorescent lights with paper cups balanced in their hands and stories too heavy to keep carrying alone. Some nights we laughed harder than expected. Other nights someone cried while the rest of us sat nearby in understanding silence. There was comfort in being surrounded by women who no longer pretended life had unfolded the way they once imagined. One evening after the support meeting ended, Diane stopped me near the staircase holding her phone loosely against her chest. "Do you mind if I show you something?" she asked. I followed her downstairs where the bookstore had already closed for the night. Lamps cast warm pools of light across the shelves while rain drifted softly against the front windows. Diane opened a video on her phone and handed it to me. My stomach tightened the second I heard my own voice. It was a recording from the previous week's support group meeting. I watched myself sitting near the back wall wearing a cream-colored cardigan, while quietly telling strangers how my husband walked away after my diagnosis, because caring for me no longer fit the retirement he wanted. I remembered feeling fragile that night. Small. But the woman on the screen did not look fragile at all. She looked calm. Honest. Human. Claire recorded it for the women who missed the meeting, Diane explained carefully. I hope you are not upset. I kept watching silently while my own voice filled the quiet bookstore. I spent 40 years believing loyalty meant enduring everything quietly, the woman in the video said. But now I think real love stays when life stops being convenient. Diane studied my expression nervously. I shared the clip on the bookstore page this morning, she admitted softly. People have been responding all day. She turned the phone toward me again. Thousands of views. Hundreds of comments. Women from Texas, Ohio, Arizona, Oregon. Some wrote about husbands who abandoned them during illness. Others described marriages where they slowly disappeared while keeping everyone else comfortable. One comment simply read, "She speaks like every woman I know but nobody listens to." I stared at the screen so long my tea went cold beside me. It felt surreal knowing strangers across the country had heard my voice while Richard had spent years barely hearing me at all. The next morning, my phone rang 3 times before noon from unfamiliar numbers. A local women's wellness group invited me to speak at a community luncheon. A small podcast host asked if I would share my story on an episode about resilience after divorce later in life. Then, just after lunch, Diane called sounding breathless. "You are not going to believe this," she said. Channel 8 saw the bookstore video. I nearly dropped the mug in my hand. The television station. Their producer wants to interview you for a morning segment next week. I laughed immediately because the idea sounded ridiculous. Me? Evelyn Carter from Maplewood Lane, who spent the past 3 months crying quietly over medical bills and canned soup dinners. But Diane did not laugh with me. People connect with honesty, she said gently. And you stopped hiding yours. The days leading up to the interview felt strangely unreal. Diane helped me choose a pale blue blouse that brought warmth back into my face, while Claire trimmed my hair in her kitchen one Saturday afternoon. You look lighter, Claire observed while brushing silver strands from my shoulders. I almost argued with her before realizing she was right. The circles beneath my eyes had softened. My posture no longer curved inward apologetically. Even my doctors noticed the difference during appointments. "Whatever you are doing emotionally," one nurse told me quietly while checking my blood pressure, "keep doing it." The night before the television interview, I barely slept. Rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows while moonlight stretched pale across the empty side of the bed Richard once occupied. But something had changed inside me during the months since he left. The loneliness was still there sometimes. The grief too. Yet neither one controlled the room anymore. Around 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs and stood quietly in the kitchen drinking chamomile tea while the refrigerator hummed in the silence. My reflection stared back at me faintly from the dark window above the sink. For the first time in years, I did not see a woman waiting for someone else to choose her. I saw someone who had survived being abandoned without disappearing. The next morning, a black town car arrived outside my house at 7:30 sharp to take me to the studio downtown. As I stepped onto the front porch holding my coat tightly against the cool spring wind, I noticed sunlight breaking through clouds above the neighborhood. And somewhere nearly 1,800 miles away in Scottsdale, Arizona, Richard Carter was about to see the woman he thought he left behind. The television studio smelled like fresh coffee, makeup powder, and overheated electronics. Young production assistants wearing headsets moved quickly through narrow hallways carrying clipboards and bottled water, while bright monitors glowed from every direction. I sat quietly in a small dressing room, with my purse folded neatly on my lap trying to steady my breathing. Across the mirror, round vanity lights reflected softly against the pale blue blouse Diane helped me choose. A makeup artist no older than 30 brushed powder lightly across my cheeks and smiled warmly at me through the mirror. "You have beautiful eyes," she said casually. I almost cried right there in the chair, because I could not remember the last time anyone noticed something about me that was not connected to illness, sadness, or survival. The segment producer walked in 10 minutes later holding a stack of papers. "Ms. Carter, we are so honored you are here," she said. "Your story has really touched people." Story. The word still sounded strange to me. To me, it had simply been my life unraveling quietly inside an empty house, while rain tapped against the windows and medical bills piled across the dining room table. But somehow strangers heard something inside that pain, which made them feel less alone. The host greeted me warmly moments before cameras rolled. Her name was Rebecca Sloan, one of those polished morning anchors with calm eyes and effortless confidence. Yet when she shook my hand, her expression softened in a way that felt sincere. "Thank you for being willing to share this," she whispered before we walked onto the set together. Bright studio lights warmed my face instantly as cameras adjusted around us. Beyond the stage, crew members moved silently behind large monitors while the countdown began. 5 seconds. 4. 3. Then suddenly we were live. Rebecca introduced me simply. Evelyn Carter is a retired writing instructor whose deeply personal message about resilience later in life has inspired thousands online. Inspired. I almost laughed hearing that word attached to me. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting alone in my dark kitchen eating canned soup while trying not to panic over insurance paperwork. Now strangers across the state were hearing my voice through television speakers over morning coffee. Rebecca asked gentle questions at first. How had life changed after my diagnosis? What did loneliness look like at this stage of life? When did I realize I deserved more than quiet abandonment? I answered honestly because I no longer had the energy to hide behind politeness. I think many women my age were taught that love means enduring everything quietly, I said at one point. But silence can slowly erase you if you are not careful. The studio became very still after that sentence. Even the camera operators seemed frozen for a moment. Rebecca leaned toward me slightly. "What would you say to someone watching this who feels abandoned right now?" I looked directly into the camera without planning to. For one strange second, it felt like speaking to every lonely woman sitting alone in a kitchen somewhere wondering if being left behind made her unworthy. "I would tell her this," I said softly. "Someone leaving during your hardest season does not define your value. It reveals theirs." Nobody spoke for a heartbeat afterward. Then Rebecca smiled slowly and touched my hand. "That is incredibly powerful," she whispered. Nearly 1,800 miles away in Scottsdale, Arizona, Richard Carter was sitting on the outdoor patio of a golf resort holding a half-finished glass of white wine when my face appeared across the mounted television above the bar. At least that was how Caroline later described it after one of Richard's old friends called her in shock. Apparently Richard froze the second he heard my name. The woman beside him asked if something was wrong, but he barely answered. He just stared at the screen while I sat beneath studio lights speaking calmly about surviving abandonment later in life. According to his friend, Richard looked pale the entire interview. He kept muttering, "That is Evelyn," like he could not understand how the exhausted woman he abandoned had somehow transformed into someone the world actually listened to. Back at the studio, the interview ended with applause from crew members behind the cameras. Rebecca hugged me tightly before commercial break while assistants rushed around preparing the next segment. You have no idea how many people needed to hear that today, she told me quietly. But the strangest part came afterward. As Diane and I stepped outside the studio building into warm May sunlight, my phone would not stop vibrating inside my purse. Messages. Emails. Interview requests. Women. Sharing stories from every corner of the country. One message simply read, "You made me feel visible again." I stood there on the sidewalk beneath the bright blue sky, while city traffic hummed around us, and realized something extraordinary. Richard spent 41 years making me feel small. It took losing him to finally understand how much space my voice could actually fill. 3 days after the television interview aired, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen watering the small basil plant near the window when I saw a silver rental car pull slowly into my driveway. At first I assumed it belonged to one of the neighbors, because nobody visited unexpectedly anymore. Then the driver's door opened, and Richard stepped out wearing pressed khakis and sunglasses, like he was arriving for a golf reservation instead of walking back into the ruins of a marriage he abandoned. For a moment, I simply stood there holding the watering can while sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor behind me. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically older exactly. Smaller somehow. The confidence he carried for decades no longer fit him properly. Richard paused near the front walkway staring at the house, with an expression I could not immediately recognize. Regret, maybe. Or confusion that the life he walked away from had continued existing without his permission. When the doorbell rang, I waited several seconds before answering. Not to punish him. Just because I no longer rushed toward people who once left me standing alone. Richard removed his sunglasses the second I opened the door. His eyes scanned my face carefully, like he was searching for traces of the woman he abandoned 6 months earlier. "Evelyn," he said softly. I noticed immediately that he looked nervous. Richard Carter never looked nervous. During 41 years of marriage, he carried himself like a man completely certain the world would always organize itself around his comfort. But standing on that porch beneath warm May sunlight, he suddenly looked unsure where to place his hands. "I saw the interview," he added after a long silence. "I figured." He nodded awkwardly. "You look good." I almost smiled at the simplicity of the sentence. Not beautiful. Not inspiring. Just good. Like he still did not know how to speak to me unless the conversation stayed safely practical. I stepped aside politely and allowed him into the house. The same house he left before sunrise, carrying suitcases across the hardwood floor, while I sat upstairs trying not to cry loud enough for him to hear. Richard walked slowly through the living room, glancing at familiar furniture and framed photographs like a tourist revisiting a hometown after many years away. "The place looks different," he murmured. "I painted the dining room," I replied calmly. What I did not say was that the entire house felt different, because I no longer spent every day trying to make it emotionally comfortable for him. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where so many silent dinners once happened. Outside, lawn sprinklers ticked rhythmically across neighboring yards while birds moved through the maple trees lining the street. Richard folded and unfolded his sunglasses several times before finally speaking again. "I made a mistake, Evelyn." There it was. The sentence I once imagined hearing during countless sleepless nights. Yet now that it finally arrived, it landed softly inside me without causing much damage at all. "Did you?" I asked quietly. Richard leaned forward heavily, suddenly looking every bit of his 70 years. "I was scared," he admitted. "Everything happened so fast. The diagnosis. The treatments. I kept thinking about my father taking care of my mother for years, and..." He stopped speaking when he realized I was simply listening instead of rescuing him from discomfort the way I used to. "I handled it badly," he finished weakly. "Handled it badly." I stared at the man across from me and felt something strange settle over the room. Not anger. Not revenge. Just clarity. Richard still described abandoning his sick wife like a customer service issue that could be corrected with the right wording. He talked about fear, stress, confusion. But nowhere in his explanation was there genuine understanding of what those months had actually felt like for me. The isolation. The humiliation. The nights spent crying quietly into pillows while wondering whether illness had made me impossible to love. You know what surprised me most after you left? I asked softly. Richard looked up carefully. What? I folded my hands together on the table. How peaceful the house became once I stopped waiting for someone to care. His expression shifted instantly. Pain flickered across his face before disappearing behind defensiveness. Evelyn, come on. I came all this way because I want to fix things. No, I replied gently. You came because you finally saw me. Silence filled the kitchen after that. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees while sunlight drifted slowly across the countertops. Richard looked down at his wedding ring for several seconds before speaking again. I never thought you would end up doing all this. Television interviews. Speaking invitations. Articles online. Women writing letters thanking me for making them feel visible again. Everything Richard once dismissed as emotional nonsense had somehow become the thing connecting me to the world. Neither did I admitted honestly. Then for the first time since he arrived, Richard looked directly at me with something close to desperation in his eyes. Is there any chance we can start over? I studied him quietly across the kitchen table. The man who left because he thought my life was ending had returned only after discovering it had meaning without him in it. Richard stayed silent after asking if we could start over. The kitchen felt unusually still around us, filled only with the faint ticking of the clock above the stove and the distant sound of lawn equipment somewhere down the block. Sunlight rested across the dining room doorway in long golden stripes, while dust drifted slowly through the air. For a moment, I studied the man sitting across from me and tried to remember the version of myself who would have done anything to keep him from leaving. That woman felt very far away now. I used to think losing you would destroy me, I said quietly. Richard lowered his eyes immediately. His fingers tightened around the sunglasses resting on the table between us. Evelyn, but the strange thing is, I continued softly, I started finding myself after you left. He looked genuinely wounded hearing that. Years ago, seeing pain in Richard's face would have made me rush to comfort him. I would have softened my words. Changed the subject. Protected him from guilt even when I was the one bleeding emotionally. But something inside me had changed over those 6 months alone. Suffering had stripped away the version of me that constantly apologized for existing. Richard leaned back heavily in the chair and rubbed one hand across his jaw. I know I do not deserve forgiveness, he admitted. I handled everything terribly. Again, that careful language. Like our marriage had simply experienced unfortunate timing instead of betrayal. I stood slowly and carried both untouched coffee mugs to the sink. Outside the kitchen window, birds fluttered around the feeder Claire installed near the garden after my treatments began. The yard looked greener than it had in years. Healthier somehow. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked while rinsing dishes beneath warm water. It was not the diagnosis. It was realizing the person I spent 4 decades protecting only loved me when life was easy. Richard did not answer immediately. When I finally turned around, he looked older than I had ever seen him. Not because of wrinkles or grey hair. Because regret has a way of collapsing people inward. I was afraid, he whispered again. I know, I replied gently. But I was the one who was actually sick. Silence settled heavily between us after that. Somewhere upstairs, the old air vent rattled softly before going quiet again. Richard stared down at the kitchen table while I dried the coffee mugs carefully and placed them back inside the cabinet. For the first time in our marriage, I was no longer afraid of uncomfortable silence. Eventually he stood and walked slowly toward the living room. His eyes drifted across family photographs lining the shelves. Caroline at 16 holding her driver's license. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Vacation pictures from Cape Cod and Vermont. 41 years reduced to framed moments frozen behind glass. I really did love you, Evelyn, he said quietly without turning around. I believed him. That was the tragic part. Richard probably did love me in the only way he knew how. But some people love comfort more than commitment. And the second life demanded sacrifice instead of convenience. His version of love collapsed under pressure. I walked him to the front door a few minutes later. Warm evening air drifted through the screen, while neighborhood sprinklers hissed softly across nearby lawns. Richard paused on the porch and looked at me with the expression of someone arriving too late to save something already gone. If things were different, he started carefully. They are different, I interrupted softly. He nodded once, almost to himself. Then he stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the rental car waiting in the driveway. Halfway there, he stopped and turned back around. For a second, I thought he might say something dramatic. Something worthy of movies or old love songs. Instead, he simply looked at me standing in the doorway of the home we built together and whispered, "I am sorry." This time, I believed that too. I watched the car disappear down Maplewood Lane beneath the fading orange glow of sunset. Then I closed the front door gently behind me. Not angrily. Not triumphantly. Just peacefully. The house no longer felt haunted after he left the second time. It felt quiet in the way libraries feel quiet. Safe. Intentional. Mine. A month later, I stood backstage at a women's wellness conference in downtown Chicago preparing to speak before nearly 500 attendees. The ballroom buzzed softly beyond the curtains while organizers adjusted microphones and stage lights overhead. Diane squeezed my hand before taking her seat near the front row beside Caroline and Claire. "Ready?" she asked with a smile. I glanced toward the stage entrance where warm light spilled across the floor. 6 months earlier, I could barely stand in a grocery store parking lot without feeling abandoned by my own life. Now women traveled across multiple states to hear me speak about survival, dignity, and rebuilding after heartbreak later in life. The event coordinator nodded toward me from backstage. "You are on. In 30 seconds, Ms. Carter." I took one slow breath and stepped toward the light. Somewhere far behind me existed a version of Evelyn Carter, who believed being left behind meant she was no longer worth choosing. But that woman no longer controlled my story. The illness nearly broke me. Losing my husband nearly erased me. But in the silence that followed, I finally heard my own voice clearly for the very first time.